We are currently witnessing a catastrophic civilization-wide atrophy of the human will, a statistical collapse where 99% of the population is operating with a psychological architecture designed for a world that no longer exists, creating a feedback loop of anxiety, fragility, and paralysis. You have been sold a lie that comfort equates to safety, but the data reveals that the absence of struggle has not birthed happiness, but rather a profound, crippling weakness that shatters under the slightest pressure of reality. But there is a hidden mechanism, a biological switch identified by the American Psychological Association, that proves your mental state is not a fixed genetic sentence, but a malleable construct you can engineer through specific targeted protocols. We are not here to discuss motivation, which is a volatile and useless resource. We are here to discuss reconstruction. We are going to dismantle the biological fallacy that you should avoid pain and replace it with the cold, hard data of psychological warfare, exposing the mechanism of stress inoculation to build a mind so strong it terrifies the average person. By the end of this briefing, you will possess the precise neurobiological keys to short-circuit your fear response, reprogram your amygdala, and access a state of high-functioning discipline that others view as impossible. This is not self-help. This is self-actualization through strategic, voluntary adversity. The secret lies in a single neurological override that you have never been taught. To understand the architecture of a resilient mind, we must first accept the foundational doctrine that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, a concept that is not merely philosophical, but deeply rooted in the neurobiology of resilience as defined by the National Institutes of Health. The subject protocol begins with the adversity filter, a cognitive reframing technique that recodes external friction not as a problem to be solved, but as resistance training for the psyche, fundamentally altering the neural circuitry in your prefrontal cortex. When you stop wishing for a different reality and engage with the current one, you activate a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life, proving that mental strength is a muscle forged exclusively through voluntary exposure to adversity. The American Psychological Association explicitly states that resilience is not a trait that people either have or do not have, but involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed in anyone, meaning your current state of weakness is a choice, not a destiny. We look to the stress inoculation model, which suggests that exposure to manageable threats helps the individual develop coping mechanisms for larger crises, effectively callousing the mind in the same way friction calluses the skin. This is the operational shift required. You must reject the expectation of ease and actively seek out the friction that signals growth. If you are not encountering resistance, you are physically degrading the neural pathways responsible for courage and executive function. The Goggins protocol serves as our primary case study here, demonstrating that physical transformation is merely a lagging indicator of a radical mental overhaul, where the operator forces the biological vessel to endure immediate, high-intensity discomfort to override the flight response, thereby reprogramming the fear response from a paralytic state to an active, problem-solving state. We must now address the statistical backbone of high achievement, which is not intelligence, talent, or luck, but a distinct psychological trait known as grit. Research by Dr. Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania has provided the empirical weight to the concept of voluntary adversity, establishing that the ability to sustain effort despite failure is the primary determinant of success, surpassing IQ as a predictor of high achievement. This data proves that the individual who possesses passion and perseverance for long-term goals will inevitably outmaneuver the individual who relies solely on innate cognitive ability. The protocol demands that you divorce yourself from the idea of talent and marry the concept of effort count, realizing that effort counts twice. Talent times effort equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement. When you apply this to the crying mind methodology, you realize that the sensation of wanting to quit is simply a biological signal that you are entering the zone of adaptation, the precise moment where the neurobiological reconfiguration occurs. Most people interpret fatigue as a stop signal, but the operator interprets fatigue as the starting line. This is where the concept of mental toughness distinguishes itself from resilience. While resilience is the ability to bounce back, mental toughness is the ability to thrive and perform better under pressure. A study on mental toughness validates our self-actualization tag by showing that high mental toughness correlates with positive adaptation to stress, suggesting that callousing exercises don't just numb pain, but enhance executive functioning and emotional control under duress. You are not building a mind that cannot feel pain. You are building a mind that categorizes pain as information rather than a threat. This requires a systematic rejection of the talent myth and an embrace of the grind reality, where the volume of work you can endure is directly proportional to the magnitude of the outcome you can command. Moving into the tactical habits of the protocol, we encounter the non-negotiable requirement of physiological reprogramming through voluntary hardship, specifically the use of cold exposure and extreme physical exertion to manipulate the brain's neurochemistry. This is not about health trends. This is about compliance training for the central nervous system. When you submerge the body in freezing water, the brain is flooded with norepinephrine and dopamine, triggering a massive fight or flight response that you must consciously override with executive control. The National Institutes of Health review on the neurobiology of resilience details how active coping strategies during such stress physically alter neural circuitry in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala. By forcing the body to remain still in a state of high-intensity discomfort, you are effectively training the brain to separate the physical sensation of panic from the behavioral reaction of fleeing. This creates a gap between stimulus and response, a tactical advantage that transfers directly to high-stakes business or social environments. Furthermore, physical exertion serves as a feedback loop where physical weakness begets mental weakness. You cannot house a strong mind in a weak vessel because the brain monitors the body's capacity for survival and adjusts its confidence levels accordingly. Strengthening the vessel strengthens the command center. We also integrate focus training, often mislabeled as meditation, which is the practice of observing impulses without acting on them, essential for emotional regulation. This is about focus control, the ability to keep your attention locked on a target despite internal or external chaos. When you lift heavy weights or sit in the cold, you are not just building muscle or tolerance, you are engaging in a process of structural remodeling of the brain, increasing the density of gray matter in areas responsible for self-regulation and decreasing the reactivity of the stress response centers. You are literally building a biological armor that makes the average daily stressors of modern life bounce off you like bullets off a tank. The next phase of the protocol is emotional containment, anchored by the tactical implementation of the 5-second pause, a mechanism designed to short-circuit the amygdala hijack. The amygdala hijack is an immediate, overwhelming emotional response that is out of proportion to the actual stimulus because it has triggered a significant emotional threat, bypassing the logic centers of the brain. When stress hits, the average operator reacts instantly, driven by ancient survival code that is maladapted for modern social conflict. The superior operator inserts a tactical gap, a mandatory 5-second silence between the trigger and the reaction. During these 5 seconds, you are allowing the neurochemical flood of cortisol and adrenaline to peak and begin to subside, allowing the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, to re-engage for logical decision-making. This pause is the difference between a disastrous emotional outburst and a calculated strategic maneuver. The goal is to become unreactive, to derive power from the ability to remain still while the environment is chaotic. This is consistent with the findings on mental toughness, which prioritize emotional control as a key component of performance. You must understand that every time you react emotionally to a situation, you are leaking power and handing control over to the external environment. By mastering the pause, you reclaim agency. You become a ghost to the emotional radar of others, unpredictable and formidable. This containment strategy also applies to the internal dialogue. When a negative thought loop initiates, you treat it as a foreign invader and neutralize it with the pause, refusing to feed it with attention or emotion. This practice requires relentless consistency, as the brain's default mode is reaction. You are retraining decades of evolutionary programming to prioritize long-term strategic advantage over short-term emotional relief. We must radically recontextualize our relationship with failure, viewing it not as a verdict on our worth, but as raw data for the iteration process. The fear of failure is the single greatest inhibitor of action, paralyzing the potential of the mind before the first step is even taken. In this protocol, failure is rebranded as tuition, the necessary cost paid for the acquisition of mastery. The crying mind methodology posits that if you are not failing, you are not testing the limits of your capacity, and therefore you are stagnating. Dr. Duckworth's research on grit emphasizes that the ability to sustain effort despite failure is the hallmark of high achievers. This means you must detach your ego from the outcome and attach it solely to the effort. When you adopt the mindset that failure is impossible because every outcome yields valuable intelligence, you remove the emotional weight of errors, allowing for rapid iteration in the process of failing forward. This is the operational definition of growth mindset, the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. Operators must understand that the pain of failure is transient, but the regret of inaction is permanent. By actively seeking out situations where failure is a high probability, you desensitize the ego to the sting of defeat. You begin to see failure as a sterile metric, a red light on the dashboard that simply indicates a need for adjustment, not a reason to abandon the vehicle. This perspective shift changes the chemical response to failure from a depletion of dopamine to a spike in determination. You stop asking, "What if I fail?" and start asking, "What will I learn when I miss?" This makes you dangerous because a person who is not afraid to lose is a person who cannot be controlled by fear. Finally, we arrive at the apex of the protocol: discipline supremacy. We must aggressively discard the concept of motivation, which is identified as a volatile, unreliable resource that fluctuates with your blood sugar and emotional state. Relying on motivation is a strategy for amateurs. The truth of discipline is that it is binary. You do the work or you do not. How you feel about the work is entirely irrelevant to the objective. Discipline is the ability to execute duties in the absence of emotion, to perform at the highest level when you feel at your lowest. This is the core of the voluntary adversity doctrine. You select tasks that cause dread, waking at 0400, cold plunges, fasting, and execute them immediately to sever the link between feeling and doing. The moment you negotiate with yourself, you lose. The superior operator understands that the mind is a tool that must be sharpened against the whetstone of monotony. It is easy to work when it is exciting. It is the ability to grind through the boredom, the pain, and the silence that separates the elite from the herd. This is where the self-actualization tag becomes reality. You are not finding yourself. You are creating yourself through a series of micro-decisions where you choose the hard path over the easy path. Every time you override the desire for comfort, you lay down a new layer of mental armor. You must become a machine of execution, where the input is the objective and the output is the result, with zero processing power wasted on emotional resistance. This is the state of total agency, where you are no longer a slave to your impulses, but the master of your fate. You simply do not give yourself the option to drift. The protocol has been delivered. You now possess the intelligence required to reprogram your neural architecture and build a mind that is immune to the chaos of the modern world. But intelligence without execution is merely entertainment. You must take these directives: the cold exposure, the 5-second pause, the rejection of motivation, and integrate them into your daily existence immediately. Do not wait for a better time. The time is now. This channel, The Crying Mind, is your command center for this ongoing psychological operation. We do not provide comfort. We provide the blueprints for power. If you are ready to leave the 99% behind and commit to the path of voluntary adversity, confirm your status by subscribing now. The world is breaking. Ensure you are the one thing that remains solid. End transmission.